Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for tuning in today. My name is Katie Peace. I'm the Director of Communications for the Preservation League of New York State. Right off the top, I do want to let you know that live transcription is enabled for this webinar today. If you need or want subtitles, you can turn those on in the toolbar in your Zoom screen. We also have ASL interpreters joining us today from Interpretech in Rochester, so thank you to them. If you have made your way to this webinar but are not familiar with the Preservation League, we are New York's statewide nonprofit focused on investing in people and projects that champion the essential role of preservation in community revitalization, sustainable economic growth, and the protection of our historic buildings and landscapes. The League does this work in every corner of New York State in lots of different ways, from offering technical services, our grant programs, including our signature Preserve New York and Technical Assistance grants, our 7 to Save program of endangered historic sites across the state, our public policy and advocacy work that we do at the local, state, and federal levels, our Excellence in Historic Preservation Awards, honoring the very best in the field of historic preservation. Our awards are actually coming up on November 7th, so hopefully you can tune in to find out who this year's winners are. And we have a whole slate of online programming like webinars, like this one. So today we're going to be talking about disability justice and preservation. This is a topic that is very near and dear to me personally, and it's something that I think isn't talked about enough in the historic preservation field. So we're really excited to have a great panel today to talk about this topic, really digging deeper into how historic sites can be accessible, and not just in terms of like getting people in the door, but then once you get people in the door, how do they feel in that space? Do they feel welcome? Do they feel safe? So kind of a more holistic approach to how we talk about this topic. And so I'm excited that we are joined by a really great panel today who can talk much more eloquently than I can about this topic today. So we are going to be joined by several panelists, and our moderator today is Laura Leppink. She's the Research and Access Assistant at the University of Minnesota and Board Chair of the Northern Bedrock Historic Preservation Corps. She'll kind of be tying everything together for us today. And then our panelists are Nicole Belolan, Public Historian in Residence at the Mid-Atlantic Regional Center for the Humanities at Rutgers. Perri Meldon, the Disability History Fellow at the National Park Service. She's also a PhD candidate at Boston University. And then Manar-ul, founder and principal strategist of Swaby Access, who's been doing really great work with the Historic House Trust in New York City. And so before I turn things over to Laura to kind of kick us off, I do want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded. You can find the recording after we wrap up today on our YouTube channel and our website. It's also streaming live on our Facebook page, so you can find it there as well. If you have questions during anyone's presentation, please do drop those questions in the Q&A box. The chat will remain open for general comments. I'll try to drop links there as people mention things that I can pull up, but questions should go in the Q&A box, and then Laura will try to get to as many of those audience questions as possible during the group conversation. And so with that, I am going to hand things over to Laura to get us started.
Hello all, this is Laura Leppink speaking. I am a white woman with longish blonde hair, blue eyes, wearing a black tank top with a gray blazer, with wood bookcases behind me with books and trinkets on them. First of all, I want to thank Katie and the Preservation League of New York for inviting us all here today and for their thoughtfulness in implementing best practices of accessibility. I am so excited for this roundtable and to have what I'm sure will be a wonderful conversation about disability justice and historic preservation. Before I shift over to our three presenters, I wanted to take a moment to contextualize our conversation today. I'll start with a bit of my background and why these conversations are important to me. I want to note that I am here as a representative of the Repair Disability Heritage Collective, which is a non-hierarchical group of learners based out of the University of Minnesota, looking to disability scholars and activists to inform our work in historic preservation and public history. We aim to understand the numerous ways disability justice as a methodology can be applied to any place-based history in order to accelerate disability justice. Over the past few years, we have devoted ourselves to deepening our understanding of how dismantling ableism and addressing disability might transform fields such as planning, design, public history, and heritage conservation. We all come from different backgrounds and have varying fields of expertise, but ultimately we still feel we're all learners in the field of disability studies and disability justice. We invite you all to become learners with us. I believe that our three presenters today, Nicole, Perri, and Manar, are practitioners already doing the critical work Repair has been looking into. And all three panelists provide starting points for practitioners in historic preservation and heritage conservation to engage in collective dialogue surrounding questions of accessibility, justice, and ableism. One reason I'm so excited to hear from our panelists is that they all have different approaches in different fields that all integrate a disability lens that offers practical and theoretical food for thought, no matter what the basis of your work is. If I can speak for us all today, we all understand that we might introduce ideals and ideas to you all today, but we also privilege and acknowledge the need for practical solutions. Fostering accessibility in numerous forms takes time, and our hope is that by starting these conversations, individuals and organizations will slowly build capacity and expertise so that becomes easier and takes less energy. Integrating accessibility and equity from the beginning of a process to the end can be intimidating, but today I think we can all look forward to hearing the experiences of how practitioners implement and creatively think about these topics in an approachable way, and ultimately how to also adopt a disability-forward lens. With that, I want to introduce our first panelist, Nicole Belolan. Nicole is a historian of 18th and 19th century American social and cultural history and specializes in disability history. She has a PhD in the history of American civilization and an MA from the Winterthur program in American material culture from the University of Delaware. Currently, Nicole is the public historian in residence at the Mid-Atlantic Regional Center for the Humanities at Rutgers University-Camden, where she also directs a continuing education program in historic preservation. Also in her position at Rutgers, she is the co-editor and digital media editor for the National Council on Public History. She publishes and regularly speaks about disability history, access, and inclusion. Additionally, Nicole is the secretary of the Disability History Association. And my favorite as a tradesperson, I love that she is also working on restoring her own 1916 house with her husband. Finally, I do want to mention that along with Marla Miller, Nicole is co-editing the Dublin Seminar for the New England Folklife Proceedings for 2021, which features essays about disability history from the 17th century through the 20th century. And it should be coming out sometime this next year. With that, I am going to pass it off to you, Nicole.
Thank you, Laura. I want to put an access copy of my talk into the chat. And I see that my functionality might only go to hosts and panelists. So if somebody could pass that on to others, I would most appreciate it. This talk access copy includes a draft of my talk, and it also includes the images. And I'll also post this to my website afterward if you want to take another look. I will now share my screen. If anybody can't see that, just give me a heads up. Thank you so much for having me here today. I look forward to learning from my co-panelists and from our discussion from all of you. I am a white woman with long brown hair and glasses sitting in my dining room. I don't identify as disabled. I put a link in the chat to an access copy of the talk if you want to follow along. It also includes some readings at the end, which should give you a sense of just some of the many scholars and activists I've learned from. I am also currently dealing with a cold, so please excuse my congestion and occasional cough or sniffle. I'm going to talk a bit today about how I got interested in advocating for disabled people in the cultural heritage sector. My interest in disability justice developed from my work as a historian. I got interested in disability history through my research on a woman named Anne Warder. She's pictured here in ambrotype wearing a dress with a white collar and flowers printed on it. She's appears to be reclining or lying down on bedding or pillows of some sort. I was studying Anne because I was interested in explaining why the needlework she really loved, which is called Berlin work, meant something to her. A lot of people in the 19th century and today don't like Berlin work, which is a type of pictorial needlework, but she left so much of it behind. I figured, well, it has to have meaning for her. So what's that all about? It turned out one of the ways Anne Warder used this needlework was to stay in touch with friends and family while she was ill at home. And I think this photograph of her helps explain what that experience was like with her. She was constantly sending out needlework patterns and projects to friends and family. So I started to get interested in what types of objects people used in early America to live with disability. And that led me to my research on physical disability and material culture. So things like wheelchairs and crutches and artificial limbs in early America, especially between 1700 and 1840. People had studied some of these artifacts, many of these artifacts in the past, but they would often do so through a medical lens. And I wanted to know what we could learn if we thought a little bit about these artifacts as having to be related to disability history. And I don't just study these artifacts alone, but also in the context they were used. So a home interior on the street, et cetera. People then, as now, don't just use disability stuff, they interact with everything around them. One thing I found is that disabled people were relatively well integrated into everyday life. And that's counter to what most people assume when I tell them I work on disability history in the 1700s and early 1800s. There are many great material and visual manifestations of this fact. So for example, some people, especially between about 1780 and 1840, used an artifact like the one you see here at the Artemis Ward House in Massachusetts called an adult cradle. They are essentially larger versions of cradles used for babies, but adults use them to live with and manage their disability at home. And the thing that's really cool about these cradles is that unlike a bedstead, which might need to be taken up and down to be moved to another part of the house, cradles, as you can see, are quite mobile and could be carried around. And that meant that disabled people could be well integrated into their homes, into their social and familial activities. So I kept doing my research, working on my PhD. In the meantime, I was also working for the Museum Studies program at the University of Delaware on developing and teaching workshops for small museums and historic sites on all sorts of topics, ranging from podcasting to collections management. A lot of that work was funded by the IMLS, and the workshops were run by a program we called Sustaining Places, which some of you in the audience may have even taken one of our workshops. So this particular series of workshops emphasized making small changes toward larger goals. Here I'm pictured teaching a workshop on cataloging collections. And we usually did these workshops for small museums with limited resources. So in a collections management context, that might mean taking collection artifacts out of a basement and putting them on a shelf on the first floor of a historic house museum. So I got pretty good at facilitating this sort of professional development, and I still do that as part of my job at Rutgers. In the meantime, I started giving papers at conferences about my research on disability history, and I started meeting more people involved with disability history and disability advocacy. And I started learning a whole new set of skills and a whole new way of approaching the world. I learned about providing access copies for talks. So if people wanted to follow along using a printed copy, or in this case today, a copy on your own screen, you could do so. I learned that we should insist on people using microphones. This is good for folks who are hard of hearing, but also for the person in the back of the room. I learned about asking about people's access needs ahead of time and not making them have to do it themselves. I think all of us here are interested in centering disabled people in access processes. I think we all think that's very key. I learned that sustainability should be a value that guides all the work and volunteering that we do. The great thing about these measures is that they benefit everybody. And I realized that the small museum community I was serving with these collections management workshops, podcasting workshops, could really benefit from these access-related skills that I was learning. So I started talking to groups about access and inclusion for disabled people. I felt a little bit out of my depth, but it turns out that this was new info for a lot of people. And that's when one workshop or talk started leading to another. And I started framing these workshops and talks in such a way that I thought would help these groups wrap their minds around the work. I started framing it as preservation and access for small museums and historic sites. And that's a phrase I'm sure everybody in the audience is familiar with. So this usually means preserving the historic house, the artifacts, whatever your context is, and then providing access to it. Often this comes in the form of providing access to collections research or providing tours for a historic house. But I wanted to make sure that people thought about access in terms of disability too. And I did that by promoting the adoption of these simple access tactics, like using microphones that I mentioned a few minutes ago. I also wanted to encourage people to think beyond the usual ways of providing access to historic sites. When we think about disability, you might think about doorways being too narrow for wheelchairs. And often the alternative access that is provided to a house might be a film about the interiors or a scrapbook of photographs of the interiors. But is that really the most creative way to provide access to this space? What might we need to change about historic preservation best practices that would make this access more meaningful? I see these as really creative and fun opportunities to rethink the way we make the places that we care for accessible to the public. If everyone embraced access and inclusion, we wouldn't be here today. I realized explaining the historical roots of why this access and inclusion was necessary and why the advocacy itself was necessary would be helpful. So I talked about disability in early America when disabled people were largely visible and well integrated into everyday life, but also in the 19th and 20th centuries. People restricted immigration to the US based on disability. They put people in institutions based on disability. They separated children in school settings due to disability and more. This recent history, which many of us have experienced, has affected the way we think about, not necessarily personally, but have witnessed, affects the way we think about disability so much today that there's an entire project by an activist named Alice Wong called the Disability Visibility Project. Check out the reading suggestions I have in the access copy if you want to learn more about the historians who are doing the work that I just mentioned. Another tactic I use in workshops is to bring historical disability-related artifacts and photographs I collect to the workshops. Here I am with a recent acquisition. This is a vernacular wheelchair, probably for a child, that I got in the Lancaster area. And I think bringing these things in, including photographs, crutches, other stuff I have in my collection, really helps get people talking to really bring some materiality, some hands-on thinking about what we want to figure out. Sharing now. Perhaps my favorite artifact to talk about is a crutch. I will show you briefly. We'll talk about more if you want. It's really here just to launch me into my next point. But I love talking about crutches. As access tools, they mean something different for everyone, which I think is useful to keep in mind in our contemporary context too. So for example, I've talked about a man named James Logan who identified, as he put it, a cripple after a fall in the 18th century. And he wrote a lot about being, quote, confined to crutches. But when you consider other people who used crutches, like runaway enslaved people who were using crutches, then they take on a whole different meaning. And I have a great example in my access copy that I won't read for the sake of time. And I think that that particular person I featured, a man named Nathan, didn't see crutches as confining. He saw them as tools for getting freedom. For disability, then and now, context matters. Ableism, or the exclusion of disabled people in favor of able-bodied people, has a long history. And that's why I start by talking about early American history and how relatively well-integrated and visible disabled people were in everyday life, and explain how this changed over time. I use this history as a reason to work toward a more disability justice-centered present and future. So what are you doing to make your historic sites, buildings, and landscapes more accessible and inclusive for disabled people? And what else will you do in the future? Thank you.
Hello, this is Laura speaking again. Thank you so much, Nicole, for your presentation. I always appreciate thinking about non-21st or 20th century history when it comes to disability. It's something my my coworker and colleague Sarah Pollacky also does, and it at least causes me to think a little bit more deeply. Anyways, I do want to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Perri Meldon. She currently serves as a Disability History Fellow in the National Park Service. She is based in Central Virginia and supports initiatives to expand U.S. disability history in educational and interpretive programming at parks nationwide. Perri is also a PhD candidate at Boston University, where she studies the history of American public lands and the communities that surround them. Perri, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you to the League as well for having us today for this conversation. Katie Peace has just dropped into the chat my script that I'll be working off of today. If folks would like access to my slideshow presentation, I'm happy to share it later by email. My email will be on the slide, which I'm going to share now. And please let me know if you are unable to see it or if other technical issues arise during my presentation. So thanks again. My name is Perri, and I am a Disability History Fellow in the National Park Service's Park History Program, which is based in Washington, D.C. Quick image description. I am a white woman with shoulder-length brown hair and glasses. Today's presentation is based on my 2019 collaboration with the home of Franklin D. Roosevelt National Historic Site in Hyde Park, New York. I have continued to work with the National Park Service as we consider place-based history and how to interpret the stories of people with disabilities in the past. Now, while I will today speak about my NPS work, I do want to preface I am not speaking on behalf of the National Park Service. I'm going to the next slide now. The text on the slide asks a question. What is more important, historic preservation or accessibility? And the answer is yes. Now, while this presentation is more focused on the interpretation rather than access and preservation, I argue we must go beyond accessibility compliance alone to encourage multimodal interaction with a historic site. So I do consider myself building on here what Nicole shared about material culture to branch out into interpretation of that material culture. Moving on to slide 3, imagine many of you attending this webinar from New York may have visited or even work at the home of FDR. Dedicated to portraying the former president's life, this site also interprets Roosevelt's polio diagnosis in 1921 and the ways it impacted his life thereafter. Roosevelt's wheelchair, such as the one depicted on this slide, and other assistive devices are on display throughout the home. Further, the home of FDR is one of the only national park sites that explicitly interprets disability history. Although other sites may refer to the existence of people with disabilities in the past, either who lived at or passed through these places, the home of FDR must grapple directly with FDR's lived experience as a disabled person. While we have plenty of examples for how FDR lived, his experience would not have been representative for most people with physical disabilities, let alone people with polio during his time. His class, race, and gender were all critical to the services he received and adaptations that were both created for him and that he constructed. Acknowledging the privileges that FDR had begins with acknowledging how many disability things, as Smithsonian curator Catherine Ott calls them, that FDR had at his disposal. But the absence of objects or access features shouldn't be discouraging. In fact, I see that as a real opportunity that holds significant power for interpreting US disability history. Despite the impressive collection of tangible, quote, disability things at the home of FDR, I found myself less interested in them and more in the traces of disability material culture. I believe it is these we must consider, as so often the histories of marginalized populations and those who have been othered due to their race, ethnicity, class, and gender, we often find their stories are embedded and hidden within these very places. Moving to the next slide, I am using to convey this point FDR's retreat at Top Cottage, which is a short drive from the family home. The photo on this slide depicts the veranda of Top Cottage. In the bottom left of this photo, I bring your attention to a mound of dirt that sits just below the edge of the veranda floor. At all other edges of the veranda, the ground is roughly 2 feet below. FDR would not have been able to descend from the veranda because of this drop. But the mound in that left-hand corner is what remains of his ramp, made of dirt. In the absence of a proper ramp, his staff packed dirt to allow him to move with relative ease into his backyard. I'm sorry I don't have a better photo of this, but it does capture how that earthen ramp has eroded over time. It's not noticeable at first, but we must train ourselves to notice these disability things in the built environment. Moving on to the next slide, slide 5. Now, of course, there are challenges to interpreting disability history in the built landscape. We must engage with material and immaterial evidence of how disabled people, or again, people who were perceived to have disabilities, how they navigated the world around them. This means that today, we must sift through transient or permanent pictures in the built environment to uncover these stories. I encourage us all to reflect on how notions of disability have shifted over time as well as geographically. Disability is often the shared denominator for people who both historically and today are not guaranteed the full rights of citizenship. According to some scholars, disability is the ultimate marker of intersectionality. Now, this isn't to suggest that the diagnosis of disability is not real. Certainly, disability is a social and cultural construct, but it is also a real experience for 1/5 of the American population today, And while the saying goes that anyone who lives long enough will become disabled is true, it is also factual that people who are lower income and non-white face higher percentages of disability than those who are white and financially comfortable. Recognition of the structural conditions that shape the lives of people with disabilities and at times create disabling circumstances are essential for interpreting American disability history. Moving to the next slide, I'm wondering then, what does that mean for the National Park Service and other places that share America's stories? I encourage us to pause and acknowledge the traces of disability history in our built environment. As one quick example, if I look outside, I see curb cuts around me in the sidewalk. There is a history to why those are there now, and they weren't there at a previous time. The built environment is full of barriers, modes of access, and the structural conditions that shape a culture's attitude towards disability. This would also mean recognizing the modes of resistance, like those creation of curb cuts, where people claimed and made space for themselves in the past. And we continue to do so today. Now, at all steps in the interpretive process in your given historic site, from the time you decide to explore a site's disability history to the time it is interpreted for the public, we must consult with organizations by and comprised of people with disabilities. As you all likely know, visitors like to see and hear themselves in the stories told and depicted at sites, and they want those stories told right. Likely, they'll be happy to have been contacted and offer feedback. Lastly, there are greater risks to not interpreting disability history. Possible risks may include 1, allowing myths around disability to perpetuate. 2, the silencing may be interpreted as disability as being something to be ashamed of or not discussed. Or 3, misrepresenting the experiences of people with disabilities, which can then impact attitudes towards people living with disabilities today. On my last slide, as for the National Park Service specifically, the Park History Program is currently working towards publishing a disability history handbook. This handbook, published in partnership with the National Council on Public History, will support interpretive and educational staff, as well as the general public, as they consider themes in U.S. disability history. Handbooks can often lay the groundwork for a future National Historic Landmark theme study or identify other sites of significance. On this slide, there is an image of the front cover of All In, Accessibility in the National Park Service 2015 to 2020. This booklet was developed by the NPS to enhance access for diverse visitors. While this document expired in 2020, I can guarantee that the Park Service is currently charting new paths in ensuring access and interpreting disability history. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and just share. The importance of this work is not limited to the National Park Service. Awareness of the intersecting processes of ableism and how they relate to gender, race, ethnicity, and class is critical for museum practitioners and historic sites and scholars alike. I encourage us to attend to these processes as we develop narratives of the built environment in scholarship, museum or historic sites, or curricula. Thank you very much.
Hello, this is Leppink speaking again. Thank you, Perri, so much for your presentation. Your comments about the intersectionality of disability and considerations in public history and historic preservation, I think are something I think about all the time. With that, our last presenter today is Manar-ul Swaby. She is the founder and principal strategist of Swaby Access, LLC, a language access and ADA effective communication consulting organization. Manar works with nonprofit organizations and government entities such as the Los Angeles County Department of Health Services, the town of Brookline, Massachusetts, and King County, Washington, to advance their accessibility practices, centering residents with disabilities and who use languages other than English. Currently, Manar is leading an initiative within the Historic House Trust of New York City, a public-private partnership with the New York City Parks Department to improve their accessibility practices across their 23 historic house museums. So finally, I will hand it over to Manar. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Laura. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to pull up my slideshow. I believe Katie put a link in the chat to my script, which also has a link to this presentation as well. Excellent. So I think that should be sharing with everybody. So again, hi, everybody. As Laura mentioned, my name is Manar Swaby. My pronouns are she and they. I'm a Black neurodivergent person. I'm wearing a blue turtleneck, white cardigan, dark blue glasses, and have a shaved head. I currently live on the ancestral land of the Osage people, currently known as St. Louis, Missouri. And I'm super excited to talk to you all about the work that I've been a part of since December 2021 with the Historic House Trust of New York City. And altogether, this project is titled An Exploration of Accessibility and Innovation within New York City Historic Houses. So to give you a little bit of background about the Historic House Trust of New York City, also known as HHT. HHT was founded in 1989. It's a private-public partnership with the New York City Parks Department, and they were founded during this time. The New York City Parks Department saw a real need to support historic houses in a very real and tangible way. So this network, essentially of historic houses, is comprised of 23 independent historic houses and sites. And that includes the historic Richmond Town that's based in Staten Island, Van Cortlandt House Museum in the Bronx, the Little Red Lighthouse in Manhattan, and a number of 20 others. So what's really interesting about—
this is Katie jumping in. We can't see your slides.
Oh no. Okay, thank you for letting me know. Can folks see that okay?
Yep.
Okay, excellent. So right now I'm on slide 2. So where am I? Yeah, so what's interesting about this structure developed by the New York City Parks Department is that the houses are physically owned and maintained by the New York City Parks Department, but they're operated, staffed, and run through independent nonprofit organizations. So the very unique role of HHT is to provide centralized structure and support to the houses. And they do that through a number of ways, including this grant-funded project. And in 2019, HHT received a grant from the New York City Community Trust, New York Community Trust, to lead an accessibility and innovation initiative. The goal of this was to identify opportunities to strengthen the experiences of people with disabilities across the network of houses. This grant was written to do so through a series of innovative accessibility projects, and ultimately to highlight and share the learnings with others in the field and within the other houses as well. So following a few shifts and pauses, in part prompted by the COVID-19 pandemic, I joined the project in December of 2021 and hit the ground running to relaunch this project. So before I jump into sharing a little bit more about me and my approach to this work, I wanted to continuously ground the work that we're in and provide some context, a sociocultural context that we're embedded in. So firstly, acknowledging that museums are sites for the people, really acknowledging that house museums, especially the ones within the HHT network, operate in their neighborhoods as community organizations. They're spaces of convening for people to join in events and engage with one another in meaningful ways. Secondly, I want to acknowledge changing frameworks of disability over time, really wanting to acknowledge that we're moving away from a medical model approach of disability that looks at disability as impairment or something wrong with the body, and shifting towards this sociocultural approach that understands that how we design spaces and experiences ultimately is what disables people. Thirdly, we want to acknowledge that there are a lot of great practices and resources out there within the museum field around accessibility, but very few of them center how we do this with limited budget and limited resources. So these are things, and there are things that people can do, but often the questions typically lend to, where do I begin? What do I prioritize? Fourthly, we also want to acknowledge that for a lot of organizations and people, the impacts of COVID-19 played in a lot of different ways. In particular, really thinking about the ways that it really expanded people's understanding for virtual communications and programming. And in some ways, it allowed folks to identify ways to build bridges with a lot of disabled people and members within the community. And lastly, wanted to acknowledge that preservation and accessibility are not contradictory. There are a number of examples where through community input, innovative solutions to honoring and maintaining the cultural and historic value takes place and still extends to disabled folks and their experiences and needs. So I wanted to set that frame. That's the context that we're in before I continue. So a little bit about me and my organization. Swaby Access, we're a small business. We work with government and nonprofit organizations engaged in language access and disability access strategy and implementation. I primarily share this slide to really highlight these three blue pillars on the screen. The first one is that we design for equity and justice. Secondarily, the core to our process is organizational transformation and workforce development. So really understanding accessibility, it's about internal process, it's about commitment, values, practices, operations, resources, and ultimately people. We're approaching this in a holistic way, and that's really important for us to move accessibility forward within the life of an organization and not just an afterthought, which for many spaces it tends to be. And lastly, meaningful community engagement is really centering input and experiences of community members and stakeholders. So I share all of that to highlight our approach in this grant project, which centers organizational strategy and design. And our typical process has a very robust discovery phase, a strategic planning phase, an implementation phase, and an optimization phase. So for this project, we tweaked that a bit to fit the very specific goals of this grant project. And the phases that we have now are discovery, analysis, pilot project implementation, analysis, and then knowledge share. So this discovery phase is composed of two main pieces, an internal needs assessment and a community needs assessment. I'm going to lean into our process and approach within the internal needs assessment, which really allowed us to understand where is HHT and where are these participating historic houses and their nonprofit partners in relation to accessibility. So we looked at their operations, practices, and infrastructure through an operational audit. And then we also used interviews and surveys with staff to learn more about their cultural and cultural attitudes within the organization. Based on this information, we leverage an organizational accessibility impact framework methodology, and that's really comprised of 2 dimensions, 5 criteria areas, and 22 indicators, all of which are meant to help us understand where is HHT as an organization network, and where are these independent historic houses in relation to accessibility. So the question really is, how mature and advanced are accessibility practices, and what opportunities are there to develop innovative practices and projects to advance accessibility within these spaces? And I'm going to give you a very quick rundown of what this methodology really entails. So the first dimension is really looking at how mature these houses are functionally in 3 primary areas. So we look at accessibility infrastructure, and that includes policy, practices, process, procedures. Secondarily, we looked at the impact on disability communities and populations. And so that's looking at existing partnerships, existing accessibility programs, accommodations, et cetera. And then lastly, we look at the overall equity and community impact. And so that's really looking at overarching practices with local communities, and particularly those that are marginalized. The second dimension, where we're looking at an organization's capacity in terms of financial resource and staffing. And within this particular project, we had 8 of the 23 houses participate in this operational audit, and those are listed on the left hand of this slide. And on the right hand of the slide is just the distribution across the 5 boroughs of New York. This slide, slide 12, shows you where each of the houses scored, how each of the houses scored in this maturity in these 3-dimensional category areas. And at the bottom of the slide, you'll see where HHT as an organization scored. So they scored initial within, and this is the maturity in particular, so initial maturity within the accessibility organizational infrastructure, initial with regards to impact on disability populations and communities, and emergent in the equity and community impact. And that's what we saw across a number of these houses, where the equity and community impact, the houses and HHT are more mature or further along. Overall, we saw a lot of the houses are, yes, in fact, operating as community centers and community-centered spaces, but there's definitely a disconnect and a lack of strategic prioritization for the experiences of disabled people. So we took all of this and we mapped it to create a visual that is more readable and legible, so that we could really see the span of maturity by resource across these different houses. And really, we wanted to, the goal of this whole project was to really identify what are these pilot projects that we're going to do, where are they going to be housed. So to do that, we conducted a series of in-person site visits. So this slide, slide 14, these are just images from those site visits, those in-person interactions. We hosted group conversations with house directors in part and asked them for their direct feedback about different pilot project ideas that we had. This slide is a screenshot of one of those digital experiences that we had with house directors. And specifically considering all the data that we pulled and gleaned from the houses, strategically we chose these 4 houses that are highlighted in green. So it's the Dykeman Farmhouse Museum, the Alice Austin House, the Lewis Latimer House Museum, and the Morris Jamel Mansion. And we're really excited because we're set to officially launch these pilot projects next week. So hopefully can follow up and share with you how that all goes. Altogether, this was an incredibly rich project, and there's so much more I could say. But before I leave, I wanted to share some of the lessons learned throughout this process that were really important for us and that we took into account in developing the pilot project plans that really center around meaningful collaboration in 3 different areas. The first is with visitors with disabilities. It's really important for us to center the experiences of people with disabilities, including within our pilot project implementation. And that includes incorporating people with disabilities during the planning, development, and launch stages. Secondarily, we wanted to really think about independent nonprofit partners and making sure that there are opportunities for collaboration. We wanted to really highlight collaboration for the houses with one another, knowing and seeing the valuable resources that they have with each other. And lastly, thinking about the role of HHT in developing the centralized infrastructure. Again, really wanting to identify what are opportunities that HHT can lean in, given their structure as a support and mediator body. So that's the end of my presentation. There's a lot more that I could share and a lot more that we're really excited to share, but I'll turn it back over to Laura. Thank you, everybody.
Hello all, this is Laura speaking again. So we are now going to move into the Q&A portion of our conversation today. Please use the question, submit your questions via the question function. That way we can read them and pose them to one of our presenters, all of our presenters. But yeah, please share in that question submission. But to start us off, I did want to start out with one question for you, Manar. With the Repair Disability Heritage Collective, we also view accessibility as a more holistic process. Could you maybe talk a little bit more about how you approach each part of this process and analysis through a disability lens?
Yes, I'd be happy to. Thank you for the question, Laura. When we talk about strategy and implementation, as I mentioned and shared on that slide with those 3 pillars, it's really important for us to think about not only people's experiences, and really think about what is the organization and what is moving to actually get there. So within every needs assessment process that we do, we're really thinking about, as I mentioned, operations. We're really thinking about what are the practices and policies, but we're also really thinking about the attitudes, the interest, leadership that exists within that as well, and understanding from all those different levels within an organization, how do we do that? I mentioned, what I didn't mention in as much depth was the community needs assessment portion. That is incredibly important, really wanting to align and build out what are the experiences of people with disabilities. I will say that's where this part of the project did fall a little bit short due to scoping and timing, and why we're really excited to build that into the pilot project portion. We're going to be working with a number of organizations, one including Art Beyond Sight, who is partnering with the Cultural Core Interns, a group of both disabled and non-disabled individuals within New York City, to support in that process as well. So we're really excited to share all the learnings that we have, but in particular for us, it's really about centering the experiences of people within the organization, and those who are stakeholders, who are ultimately end users. So hopefully that added some additional clarity there.
Definitely. Thank you so much for your answer. Yeah, community in all of these conversations is really important. And so since Invalid, one of their disability justice principles is leadership of those most impacted, which to me always means that every part of the process, we need to have disabled people in conversation. So I really appreciate your perspective on this. So okay, it looks like we have our first question. So it's from an anonymous attendee, and it reads, would you provide an overview of the current statuses of private historic home adaptations, exteriors primarily, via disability owner access, and historic commission permitting? So there's someone who might want to take a go at this one first. It's a very technical question, and I have a couple of thoughts if you all are okay with me sharing them. So my first kind of reaction is that private home ownership has very different restrictions or conditions upon them. It often will depend on their context, whether they're in a historic district or have local restrictions on them. However, I think that it really depends on where you are, and you're going to have to look into the different regulations that might apply to your own home. And so changing a historic house, even if it's listed on the National Register, unless it's tied to federal funding, you can actually make changes to that house. However, if it has more local local recognition from like a local commission, it might have more regulations on it. It gets very complicated, so it might be worthwhile reaching out to a local historical organization or a local commission that might have more answers. And if anybody has more to add on that, I'd welcome it, because it's not my area of expertise either. I think we'll probably move on to our next one. So I apologize if it doesn't cover everything. But our next question is from William Neely Jr. And it reads, thank you all so much for your presentations. As someone who has been working in the regulatory side of historic preservation for the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission, my question for each of you is, given accessibility is largely governed by various regulations, do you see ways of changing our approach to altering the built environment based on the history of differently abled people and how they made accommodations, such as moving more use of portable devices, or is the national regulatory standard the best practice for the foreseeable future?
I'm happy to get us started on this, though I'm sure that Nicole, Manar, and Laura all have thoughts here. I would, and thank you for that question. I would discourage a one-off standard for the nation. Rather, I would work within the existing regulations, whether it is the ADA, which is actually not the federal legislation that federal agencies abide by, comply with, such as the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 or the Architectural Barriers Act. Those two laws pertain to agencies and programs that are federally managed or conducted. I think that we should look at the ADA as well as these two other laws. But as Manar was laying out before us, there should also be that ongoing collaboration with organizations that you have identified. You should build relationships and have ongoing conversation towards identifying the needs of the specific site you're working on and the community that surrounds it. This is more of a process rather than a one-off, is the bottom line.
Yeah, I appreciate this question. This is Manar speaking. And actually, I'm going to pull up on, I'm going to attempt to share my screen one more time. And hopefully you all can see this. It's a list of pilot project opportunities that we leverage to discuss with the houses. And I bring this up just to highlight that accessibility is not just architectural access, it's not just physical access. For a lot of the houses, that's primarily a lot of our house directors and staff, when we spoke to them about accessibility, that's immediately where their minds went. And that's immediately where a lot of people prioritize and think about. But what we really saw, and the purpose of this project was really thinking about programmatic access. And for a lot of houses, you know, their thoughts were, well, if you can't get in the door, then we can't even really talk about the educational programming. And so there's a real combination and a real alignment between the two, but we also have to understand that accessibility is such a large term and can mean so many different things. You know, my accommodation might be very different depending on the type of disability that I have. And it will always be important to talk about architectural access, but we should also be thinking about, you know, effective communication, you know, thinking about is the programming that we have available and effective, meeting people's needs, you know, in the ways that make sense for them. So I highlight that to say that there are a lot of things that we can do within the space of accessibility. And this slide are just a number of them. And, you know, I shared in the presentation things about practices, policies, and procedures that extend to and can connect some of those pieces together, but still continuously think that being in community and understanding what are the actual needs and highlights of the community can really identify where you move forward and how, what are those first steps in that process.
I would just build on what Manar and Perri have already said and say, you know, I understand the regulation perspective, but to try to think beyond regulations or outside regulations and to go to the community to assess what the needs are for that programmatic and physical access.
This is Laura speaking again. Thank you all so much for those responses. I'm going to move on to our next question. And it's from Gregory Hubbard. And it reads, how much alteration is acceptable? Riversdale House, Prince George's County, Maryland, disability advocates insisted that an elevator be installed so there was a disability access to second floor, which would have destroyed some of the finest early American ornamental plasterwork, 1801 to 1807 in the nation. The site has already created videos, Braille in multiple languages, and the large-scale models of the house and full-size models for sighted and disabled visitors to handle and examine. The county executive stepped in and blocked the elevator. I'm wondering if this might come into question, if we can talk a little bit about how we can see accessibility and historic preservation as not being contradictory, and how we can find ways forward. I know that's a through thread that I've heard in, I think, all of your presentations.
I guess I'd be curious to know, excuse me, Gregory, what happened after the elevator was blocked? Were there further discussions about how to make the site accessible? That doesn't answer your question. I'm asking you a question in response, and I know that's hard to do in this format. Maybe somebody wants to also answer, well, in case Greg wants to respond, if you want.
Okay, this is Perri. Without being an accessibility specialist of physical structures, and from what I have seen in my time with the National Park Service, it is always a dialogue, and there is a question of undue burden that it may cause to create accommodations in a historic structure. So rather than being at odds, it's more about thinking creatively to provide alternatives that may not be equal, but are equitable for people with disabilities to access the site.
And I don't know if I have too much to add to that. Those are both really great responses as well. You know, to the root of your question, how much alteration is acceptable? You know, there's no one size fits all. And I think that's the challenge. These spaces are so unique, are so culturally rich. And it's also interesting because these spaces have shifted over time and changed over time, and that's part of their history as well. But unfortunately, there is no one size fits all. There's no magic bullet, and that's why we keep going back to, well, what is community saying, and really centering the solutions around that. You know, possibly, you know, you shared in this in your question a number of ways that you've made the space accessible. You know, were those priorities of community, and maybe there are other things that could have been done, you know, that could have, you know, lent further to specific community members. So there's always that context, and without that, it's really hard to understand, like, is this the right thing that we should have done, or should we have moved in a different path? But thanks for the question.
Yeah, thank you. This is Laura speaking. Thanks all for kind of responding to that. It's a difficult topic, and one that's existed in historic preservation for a very long time, but I think it's finding the ways that they don't have to be contradictory, and also understanding that accessibility is something that widely implemented, and even many of those things I read in this question for accessibility practices are actually ones that I don't see a lot of places taking. But I think it's about being creative, and again, about accessibility as a process rather than a singular intervention. But with that, I do want to move on to the next one. I think it's a really interesting question, and one that gets to this idea of really all of the conversations happening about physical disabilities or physical impairments versus mental disabilities or mental impairments. From the anonymous attendee, it reads, I'm curious about how disability things might be useful for interpreting mental, intellectual, emotional disabilities, as well as physical disabilities, particularly in the context of the broad idea of body minds and the mind-body being inseparable. Are there examples of this kind of interpretation that you'd point to?
I guess I'll, thanks for that question, start by just pointing out that I focus on disability history, but lots of the artifacts that I've studied were used by people with physical disability and other types of disabilities too. So there's often lots of overlap in that regard. So adult cradles are a good example of that, and all sorts of things that people have used.
With regard to interpretation, and this is Perri speaking, I think that engaging with and reflecting on the experiences of people with intellectual disabilities, there's a lot of room for creativity And this is where we might want to engage with multisensory experiences if a historic site can grapple with that. Creating tactile replicas, miniature figurines, ways that people can feel or touch. If cooking is allowed in a site, are there recipes that you knew that that person in the past enjoyed? Can you make those recipes? Of course, we in the present day can't live the exact experience that one did in the past, but it can at least allow us to reflect and hopefully build some degree of empathy or shared experience with those in the past.
Yeah, and I love that. Thank you for sharing that, Perri. This is Manar again. For those who have a copy of the slides, slide 8 that I did not present, but highlighted what some of those final projects are that we chose across the houses. One of the houses, we're going to be conducting a tactile object collections tour, another one an audio collections tour, and another a multisensory virtual tour. So there are a number of things that really can be done that really lean into, again, thinking about effective communication, thinking about different ways of highlighting the collections objects, collections experience, interpretive experience within the houses that really lend to and think about disabilities beyond just the physical. One resource that I would recommend everybody lean into and read and learn more about is the concept of universal design for learning. Universal design is a framework that was based in architectural access, specifically around disability, and it was leveraged within the education space. And it's an incredibly important framework and tool that can really allow us to understand how do we build spaces, learning experiences, and spaces that expand and are beneficial to everybody, regardless of ability. And so that's just one thing that I would recommend and can pull a digital resource for folks to check out if you haven't heard or experienced that before.
This is Laura speaking again. Yeah, I do love this question because I think invisible disabilities are a very interesting topic, and especially when it comes to physical spaces. And I think from both a accessibility intervention standpoint at historic sites, there are conversations to be had, but also, yeah, the question of body, minds, and how to not separate those and recognize their interconnectedness, I think is really interesting. My colleague Chelsea Waite from the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee does a lot of different and really interesting work on this. And I think it's one of those where we can also look to maybe written text, but other primary source materials to help us understand where, different sensory experiences might come into play, or how people's experiences space might be different based on their sensory inputs, physical inputs, but also social cultural inputs that they exist in. So anyways, thank you so much for that comment or question, I should say. I do see that we had a comment that was put in as a question. I'm going to read that aloud so everybody can make sure they see it. From David Lieb, and Perri said this in the chat, but it says that to the earlier issue about jurisdiction for single user historical residence, unless the local town or city has a designated historic district or the property has obligations because of the listing on the National Register to the State Historic Preservation Office, for example, modifications would not be limited. Living in Salem, Massachusetts, I live in a 1780 period home that is not in a defined historic district. However, across the town, there's a defined, McIntyre, probably said that incorrectly, district is very regulated, and even modifications for accessibility would likely not be allowed. Thank you so much for commenting on this. It was definitely not my area of expertise, so I appreciate the extra comment. Our next question is from Durante Rollins, and it says, thank you all working in the field of industrial revitalization, looking for guidance on approaches to more conversations past basic compliance to full accessibility. We always I'm guessing talk about cost barriers, etc. So I think that might be maybe our more comment than question, but if people have something to say about that. Okay.
Could I just jump?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. I just want to jump in, Laura, on that for that comment, Durante. Cost does come up a lot, and I encourage organizations to put a line in their budgets, their planning budgets, their operating budgets for accessibility inclusion if they don't have them. And I think it's also time for more funding organizations to provide more grant funding opportunities for access and inclusion, especially that goes beyond regulations and the ADA.
Yeah, and this is Manar speaking. Would love to jump in and add and also highlight the comment that Andrew Robley added in the chat that says, just to clarify something, providing accommodations for disabled people is not simply done to please them. It is to provide equal accessibility and a shared human experience. So I think there are two primary pieces that I want to pull out. First of all, yes, accessibility is a fundamental human right, and it's also backed by federal law. So not only legally are we, yes, in compliance, we have to meet compliance standards to do that. So it's not a matter of should we bend to the community just because whatever, like we have to do this. It's something that we need to do, but also the question of, you know, standards that exist. There's a lot of, generally when we think of the Americans with Disabilities Act, it is considered a very strong law within a lot of disability communities. It does not do enough. You know, there are basic standards that exist. And yet we also know that the ADA operates as a complaint-driven process. So you have to essentially be found to be not in compliance. You have to be found to be actively discriminating, and then we can file a lawsuit and then go through a remediation process. Ultimately, that's why we say going through a community engagement process is so important, because not only, yes, we can identify, and we can always identify these are basic standards that we need to meet regardless, point blank period. But again, how do we continue to build onto that in ways that are meaningful, that do meet people, that isn't just about fulfilling, checking a box, but actually is effective for people's actual lived experiences. So I did want to highlight that, like, yes, it's something that we have to do. It's not just something that we're doing to be nice, to, you know, just be whatever. It's something that is an absolute need that we should really be prioritizing. Similarly, through funding, similarly, you know, through training, thinking about, again, what is our entire organization? How are we structured? It's a robust process, you know, and I think a lot of people end up back in the place of just checking a box, just meeting that basic compliance, because they are ultimately end up questioning, well, where do I begin? I have so few resources. If I can check this box, then maybe that's enough. And so when we root into the experiences of people, that can help us understand, okay, where should we prioritize that? Where is there actual maybe pushback guidance that we're getting from community to be able to do this well, and not just, again, check a box and then find out later that we didn't do it as fully as we might have been able to do that. So just wanted to add that piece and tie that up. So thank you, Durante and Andrew, for those questions and comments.
Yeah, thank you so much for that comment. And I think it really does come back to the difference between, I do see a lot of checklists. You'll find so many online for accessibility. Sorry, this is Laura speaking. And one comment came to mind, I think, Nicole, that you made in a previous conversation about good, better, and best. I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about approach like that might help us like see a good path forward or the next best steps, or think a little bit more approachably about how to start implementing these ideas.
Yes, as I mentioned, when I do workshops on this topic, I usually focus on simple things, low cost or no cost things that people can do to make programming, for example, more accessible. And a lot of these tips and tricks are out in the world on the internet. I'm not the only person who advocates for them, or who, certainly not the person who developed them. So things like providing microphones or access copies, et cetera, et cetera. And And I think if you start with those little things, then you probably start to see how you can improve on what you already have. Another thing I like to encourage people to do that a lot of people just don't think of, whether you're talking about maybe just an office space you have, doesn't even have to be in a historic building, or a historic building, to provide these very getting to be more popular know before you go guides. It doesn't even have to be a guide. It's just information about the physical space and the what a person will encounter if they go to see you in your professional spot or at your museum. And this information might include things like how many steps there are going up to the front door, whether there's wheelchair access, what kinds of restrooms are available. Are they all gender, for example? Other information such as what the masking or COVID-19 policies are. The pandemic is not over. Lots of people, disabled or not, want to be in settings where masks are mandated or maybe vaccines are mandated. People want to know that information. So these are really simple places where you can get started, I think, and then build on that by interacting more with community, getting more information about what your audience wants after you start providing some of those baseline accommodations.
Thank you, Nicole. I'm going to read our next question, which is from another anonymous attendee, but it reads, thank you all for your comments. You all have mentioned speaking with disability communities to see what work needs to be done. I'm wondering if you could speak to how to go about forming these communities or finding folks to engage with around these conversations that center people with disabilities. Furthermore, how to do this without overburdening communities with disabilities.
I love this question so much. This is Manar speaking. Thank you for this question. First thing I will say, and this tends to be, well, when I work with clients, I say, where's your money? Oftentimes, when working with community, especially as organizations, that relationship tends to be quite extractive, where we're asking, what are your needs? We're asking them to devote time. We're asking them to devote resources. We're asking them to devote their expertise, share their stories. And yes, with the goal to build something for them, but really that is labor. Like there's so much labor in being continuously having to have to advocate for oneself, one's community constantly, and really thinking about this power dynamic that is at play, this relationship. To be able to build that, it really means understanding how are we pouring back in. And so generally in terms of, one strategy and approach in this sort of community needs assessment and community engagement process, I always advocate to my clients, how are we compensating the folks who are participating in these focus groups or in these surveys, in these interviews? One thing I will say is that there are so many community organizations that exist out there. There are either advocacy hubs that exist as community centers for folks, and tapping into organizations that do exist will also get you will allow you to build more like stronger relationships. In particular, I think if there is a strong visitor base already that you have, there are things that you can do as an individual organization that continue to build that trust. I think that tends to be with organizations. What I've heard often is, well, we don't have the visitorship, we don't have the relationship. If we build it, that doesn't mean they'll come, but there has to be some practices to show that faith. You have to invest in this work and you have to prioritize this work. And that is something that takes time. When trust is something that, hasn't existed for a while for some spaces and some organizations, it's something we do have to be patient with. But I will say investing, identifying practical, tangible ways that we are giving back, and then also leveraging existing organizations and structures that are in your local community are two concrete ways to move forward.
This is Perri. Thank you, Manar, for that layered and thoughtful and comprehensive response. I will just address the very concrete, tangible, how to even find these communities, honestly, a very quick Google search of your county or your town, if it's large enough, and to find the commissions or councils of people with disabilities. You can likewise plug in your county or your town or city and the words independent living center. These will take you to these very organizations that are doing this kind of work to address the needs of people with disabilities, run by and comprised of people with disabilities. If they don't have the capacity, likely they can direct you to organizations that can.
Wonderful. I'm going to swing back because there was one question in the chat from Cynthia Falk, and this one's for you, Manar, and it reads, Manar, I am wondering if your projects address new content related to ability and disability, as well as new ways to create multi-sensory access to existing content.
Yes, thank you for that question. I was actually just typing and I'm going to send it right in the chat right now, Cynthia. So I was going to, basically what this says is that the scope and the scale of these projects, they're structured as pilot projects, proofs of concept, if you will. And so really the goal of them for us is how do we develop the process, practices, and understanding of how to develop accessible programs. So they are not intended to develop new content. We're really going to be leveraging existing content. The scale of the pilot projects are over a 4-month timeline, and that includes scoping, budgeting, planning, executing, testing. So we're going through the entire life cycle of a project to be able to produce this output. But at the same time, we're really excited because we know that with this entire process, the houses are really excited to begin to explore stories, to do that work that they haven't prioritized before, and really think about how can we center stories and experiences of people with disabilities within the houses, because we know that that's true and that that exists. So hopefully that answers the question. But thank you for flagging that as well, Laura.
I do want to highlight one comment in the chat from Kate Jirick, and I really hope I said your name correctly. Apologies if I didn't. This is Laura speaking. But Kate's message says, as a person with a physical disability, I can attest that I and lots of others will often self-select out of going to a place that is perceived to be not accessible in order to not deal with the frustration of limited access. And followed up with, perhaps having people with disabilities on your staff as paid staff would help build connections. I was wondering if you all had initial thoughts on that.
This is Perri. Thank you, Kate, for plugging that in the chat. This goes back to what Nicole was sharing about good, better, best, but I can't insist enough that a website should have an accessibility page for the historic site, museum, or other public location. That way, ideally, we don't need to go to the site to only find we can't enter through the door. We can find out at least online, and then we can possibly email with the site to figure out alternative options.
Chat an essay that I like a lot called Getting in the Door is Half the Battle. It's about employment, seeking employment as a disabled person. I think everyone should read.
Awesome. And this is Manar speaking. Kate, thank you for that comment. It's incredible. Like, I'm going to keep going on and on and on talking about as an organization that includes your staffing, that it's not just about from the perspective of visitors, but thinking about what are your internal practices. Are your staff, able to actually access the spaces meaningfully, or are you only thinking about your external consumers? So all of those are incredibly important, and I think it's really important to consider all of that as a part of the process. So yeah. From an organizational perspective, we're thinking about all these different levels of how we operate as an organization, how we operate as a business, our funding streams, thinking about what are paths to employment, what are paths to advance staff members, thinking about who might be not represented within our staff membership, and how that, especially how that connects to who our audiences are, and even thinking about who exists within our neighborhood. One piece of our process that I didn't talk about, we conducted demographic analyses to really understand within the direct zip code of these historic houses, who is the population. And there's, we know that demographic data is also quite limited. It is never going to fully capture, the full diversity of a neighborhood or a specific space, but really understanding who exists in the space who exists in the space that you live, that your organization is housed, and how can you continue to build those bridges. And so thinking about, are you hiring from that direct community, from those direct communities, or are you, hiring through very specific pipelines that exclude a lot of people? So there's a lot to think about in this space, but there's always a place to begin. So hopefully folks feel encouraged today with all of what we've been sharing.
For what it's worth, I remember learning, I think, at an Outreach conference. Outreach is a disability advocacy organization in Philadelphia, that I think regional ADA centers, I hope this is correct, will look at job descriptions and help make sure that they are written in such a way that they're not ableist, essentially, that they are providing a job that doesn't have barriers to disabled people for participating in or applying to. So take a look at your job descriptions and volunteer descriptions with an eye to that, and maybe get some advice of people who are familiar with what changes you might be able to make.
Thank you all so much. This is Katie again, jumping back on just to help wrap things up. Thank you all so much for sharing all of your expertise and the work that you've been doing. And Laura, thank you so much for guiding this conversation today. I got a lot out of it. I hope that all of you in the audience did as well. We're just about approaching time here, so I just wanted to give all of you an opportunity to say any last parting thoughts before we wrap up.
I can jump in. This is Manar again. I just wanted to say thank you, everybody, for being here, for participating in the chat and asking us these really wonderful, thought-provoking questions and providing your insight. If there's anything that I could leave you with, is start with the people, start with your organization, and it's about building cultural and practices within your spaces. So, and you can do it. And we're all here to support you. So again, thanks so much, and excited to continue the conversation.
Hi again, this is Perri. I am about to drop my email in the chat. On behalf of the National Park Service, I'll just say that my colleagues and I are looking to expand more storytelling of sites, of people, of moments in U.S. disability history. So if you are aware of these stories, please reach out. I look forward to any emails and corresponding.
This is Nicole. I'll maybe just conclude by saying a piece of advice I've been given on many occasions is to be the squeaky wheel when it comes to access and inclusion.
I'm going to share something. I didn't talk a lot about repair today, but we do a number of different things, including with mapping and digital accessibility. I plugged in our link tree. So please take a gander at that if you have the time. But as a collective of learners, I have to say thank you all so much for teaching me a lot today. I feel in these conversations, there's always something new I'm jotting down to try and remember for later. So thank you.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Just so grateful that you all were here today and shared this with us, and everyone who tuned in, thank you. Thank you for asking your questions. Thank you for being here. As I mentioned at the beginning, this webinar was recorded, so if you want to watch it again or send it to your friends, you can do that. You can find it on our website, on our YouTube channel, and on our Facebook page. And we look forward to more thought-provoking conversations in the future. So hopefully you can join us for another webinar at some point, maybe in 2023. So thank you all so much for being here. Manar, Laura, Perri, and Nicole, and our interpreters, thank you all so much for your time today, and we'll see you soon.